For most of human history, life was really hard, especially if you were born in the Middle Ages when society was split into rigid classes. The king was at the top of the food chain and peasants were at the bottom. Life for them was difficult, and to make matters worse, it was also cold and damp. But they were tough people who knew how to survive. They had no central heating, and the outside temperature could plummet below freezing. Even during summer nights, temperatures would reach lows of 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. So how did peasants keep themselves warm in their freezing cold homes? What survival secrets did they know that we have forgotten over time? You're about to find out as we reveal 15 things that kept medieval peasants warm. Welcome to my channel. And today, let's find out more about how medieval peasants battled the brutal cold. Survival secrets revealed. Starting from No. 15, peat and turf. These are two different things. Peat is partly decayed vegetation that grows in places where there is a lot of rain but not much oxygen. This means it does not decay quickly and it can be used as fuel. In Ireland and northern England, peat was often cut into blocks, dried in the sun, and then stacked up beside the house so it could be used for heating purposes. Turf is something entirely different. It is basically soil that has been enriched with decomposed organic matter, and it comes in the form of bricks. These bricks are made by cutting turf and then placing them out in the sun to dry before stacking them up against the walls of your home. Number 14. Straw. Straw is the most readily available material for insulation because it is a byproduct of farming. After crops like wheat are harvested, all that is left behind is the straw. It was commonly stuffed in the cracks of the walls, and it could also be woven together to make cheap mats, which were then placed on floors. If you happen to have some extra straw, you could stuff it inside your mattress to make it warmer. During the Middle Ages, this was seen as a luxury reserved only for the rich, but it was definitely worth it if you wanted to stay warm during the winter. Non tres laus matre. Lice love dirty, sweaty clothes, which is why it was common for peasants to wear the same set of clothes over and over again. And since they couldn't wash their clothes, the only option was to get rid of the lice by burning them. Every year, peasants would take their mattresses outside and burn the lice that had infested them. Burning the mattress would kill off all the bugs, and it would also make the mattress more comfortable for sleeping on. Non doce hot water bottles. This is one medieval invention that is still relevant today. Back then, hot water bottles were made out of animal skin. A bottle would be filled with hot water and tied shut before being tucked into bed with a sleeping person. Some versions of hot water bottles even had two necks so that the water could be easily refilled without disturbing the sleeper. This is such a good idea that you should probably buy yourself one. Number 11. Close your doors. We live in an age of open concept houses and wide open spaces, but back then, peasants would keep their doors closed, even if it meant having to crawl through a small window to get inside their house. That's because they would seal their doors during the winter to keep the warmth inside. They believed that letting warm air escape would invite illness into the house. Number 10. Earthen floor. Instead of hardwood floors, medieval peasants had earthen floors. These were made out of packed clay and were very easy to maintain. They were also naturally insulating. meaning that heat from fires would stay inside the house longer. When the ground froze, though, these floors would become hard as stone. Number 9, thatch roof. Roofs were thatched in medieval times, which meant that the roof was covered with vegetation. This vegetation acted as an insulator, keeping the warm air inside and the cold wind outside. Thatched roofs were also great at keeping rain and snow out of your house. No, 8 thick clothing. Today, you would think that having layers of clothing is only for show. That's because we're generally warm inside our nice heated building. But if you only wore one thin jacket in medieval times, you would be inviting hypothermia into your life. Peasants would wear multiple layers of thick clothing to keep themselves warm, and the more layers, the better. No, 7 animal skins. Have you ever tried to light a fire with a normal stick? It's almost impossible. But if you take a log, it will catch fire easily. That's because logs have more resin in them, making them easier to ignite. And guess what? Animal skins had a lot of resin in them too, which made them perfect for use as clothing. Deer, goats, sheep, cows, and pigs were the main animals whose skins were used to make clothing. No, 6 fireplaces. Now, fireplaces might seem obvious, but you would be surprised how long it took for them to become common in peasant homes. For many years, peasants would have to rely on portable braziers or small open fires. These would not be as effective at keeping you warm as a fireplace, but at least they were better than nothing. Some peasants would build simple fireplaces with stones, while others would use metal chimneys that could be placed in the center of the room and moved around as needed. No. 5. Keeping chicken. During medieval times, peasants would keep chickens, pigs, and other livestock inside their houses. These animals provided both food and warmth. Their body heat helped to keep the house warm during the cold winters. Number 4, sleeping arrangements. People who live in cold climates today know that sleeping in a group is the best way to keep warm. The combined body heat of several people is enough to warm up a small space. That's why you see many families sleeping in the same bed. It wasn't always done out of necessity, though. Sometimes it was necessary to protect sleeping children from nighttime predators, so the parents slept with their kids. Number 3, portable ovens. Portable ovens were very popular during the Middle Ages. These were typically used for baking bread, but they could also be used to heat up a room. Small portable ovens could be moved around easily and set up wherever they were needed. Many peasants would place these in their bedrooms at night to keep themselves warm. No, 2 wooden shutters. Glass windows weren't common in medieval times, which meant that peasants had to rely on shutters to keep the cold air out. These were simply wooden boards that could be placed over the openings of a house. They weren't very effective at blocking out the cold, but they were the best thing peasants had at the time. No, 1, cuddle up to someone. One of the best ways to keep warm is to cuddle up next to someone else. This is especially true if you're already going to sleep in the same bed. But if you don't want to sleep with your family members, you can always snuggle up to your pet. During medieval times, pets like cats and dogs would sleep in the same bed as humans. Not only were they great at keeping you warm, but they were also great at killing off any vermin that might try to share your bed. Which of these tips did you find the most useful? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more amazing historical facts.